Breaking now, the House Ethics Committee did not release a report today into sexual misconduct and other allegations involving Attorney General nominee Matt Gaetz. After the committee met this afternoon, Chairman Michael Gaetz told reporters there is not an agreement by the committee to release the report. The committee had been investigating Gaetz for nearly 3 years. The former Florida representative resigned from the House last week, just days before a report on the investigation was set to be released and after Trump nominated Gaetz to be his attorney general. A lawyer representing 2 women says his client saw Gaetz having sex with a minor at a party. The lawyer says his clients testified about what they saw to the committee. Gaetz vehemently denies any wrongdoing, saying the accusations are part of a political attack, and pointed out that the Justice Department investigated and declined to charge him with a crime. The panel's meeting comes as Gaetz was on the other side of the Capitol, meeting with senators on Wednesday to advocate for his own confirmation. Several Republican senators have said they want to see the ethics panel's findings before voting on Gaetz' nomination, while waves of Democrats have called for its release. President-elect Trump continues to roll out nominees for his administration, promising radical change after he takes office early next year. The latest picks are familiar names. Linda McMahon for Education Secretary. She's a longtime Trump ally who served in the first Trump administration. And Dr. Matt Gaetz to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Of course, Dr. Oz is a celebrity doctor, best known for his long-running daytime TV show. Joining us to discuss these latest Trump picks and much more, Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Let's talk about Linda McMahon first at Department of Education. On the campaign trail, Trump said he wanted to eliminate the Department of Education and send education back to the states. So McMahon's charges to dismantle the department that she's going to lead. Easy peasy?
Not exactly easy peasy. This has been a conservative demand for a long time. Department of Education comparatively is a young department set up in 1979. The very next year, Ronald Reagan ran with the idea of dismantling the Department of Education. Then he decided against that once in office. Conservatives believe that the DOE is too involved in imposing federal mandates on local schools, but its defenders talk about its role in administering student grants, for example, student loans, I should say, and also just in general ensuring certain civil rights protections and things of that nature.
And if you look at its budget, really the majority of the focus is on higher education. 70% of the DOE budget goes towards higher education. It holds $1.5 trillion in student loan debt for nearly 43 million borrowers. Now, Biden tried to cancel some of that student loan debt. That's mostly been caught up in the courts. That strikes me as a pretty difficult decision for the Trump administration to do. What's it going to do with that push by the Biden administration to relieve some of that student loan debt?
So one of the arguments one hears on the right generally is the idea that the forgiveness of student loan debt disproportionately benefits the more affluent members of society anyway. There are a very large share of Americans who don't go to college, and of course there are some who have gone to college and paid off their debt. So there is some resistance, I think, on the right, broadly speaking, to student loan forgiveness. I would be surprised if Trump really goes through with the Biden type of policy.
Could it be politically unpopular to just abandon that cause altogether, considering there's so much debt that's owed?
It could be, and there are solid arguments made for student loan forgiveness. The other thing, just from a purely political standpoint, is, of course, President-elect Trump did make some advances with younger voters in the most recent election. You could certainly argue that if he were to sort of buck Republican orthodoxy and go ahead with student loan forgiveness, that might solidify some of those gains.
One impact where the Department of Education, one place where the Department of Education could have a big impact is on kind of these culture war issues and how LGBTQ students are treated. Trump railed against trans women participating in sports on the campaign trail. Could the Department of Education use Title IX to make an impact in that area?
So I think, the broad strokes that we know are Trump's opposition to anything that he considers woke. And clearly efforts to do with trans students are part of that whole picture. I do think that the sports issue as it pertains to the trans community was a sort of winning issue for Trump. He had a big advantage if you look at public polling in that regard. So I would expect that he will pursue those attempts to roll back on DEI policy, including in education.
Something that oscillates kind of back and forth from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump, in how the Department of Education treats Title IX and how it pertains to gender identity, sexual orientation.
That's right. And of course, there is an argument made by conservatives that the way to protect women, college women or high school girls, is to be more conservative on the trans issue. And we see in a separate issue, Congresswoman Nancy Mace casting a measure she has in terms of protecting women. Now, a lot of people disagree, a lot of people are skeptical of that framing, but it is definitely out there.
I want to talk about Dr. Oz. In his role, he would oversee the health insurance coverage of more than 150 million Americans. Trump, when he announced his pick, said that he would look to cut waste and fraud. He forgot abuse to fill out the traditional verbiage that we hear from Washington, D.C. Where, though? Where can they look to cut, because these are massive programs that a lot of people rely on?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the rubber is going to meet the road in a lot of ways, because it is very popular to say we're going to cut back on government, government is too big, until you get to the specifics. Medicare and Medicaid are broadly very popular programs. Obviously, millions and millions of Americans have benefited from those programs. Cuts by their nature to those programs tend to affect people who are very vulnerable. And so it is really a politically difficult job. People always say waste, fraud, and abuse because it is an escape route from having to name any specific programs that you would cut away.
And on the campaign trail, Trump made promises that he wasn't going to touch Medicare, so that kind of takes a big chunk of it off the table already, and you're left focusing on programs that help poor and disabled and would be potentially problematic if you start making big cuts too.
Yeah, exactly. And, at risk of stating the obvious, programs that are to do with healthcare, there are other elements of the government's budget that you could argue are flabby or wasteful. But once you get into the realm of taking healthcare away from people, I think you get into very politically treacherous ground.
Now, these picks are far from the most controversial appointments that Trump is trying to make. Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth, all up for cabinet posts, all what you could probably say are outside of the norm. Some would say not qualified for these positions. You're working on an article about this guessing game that's being played inside Washington. Who can make it through? How should we be handicapping the chances of these more controversial picks? And what do you say about the pressure that's being placed on GOP senators to approve and go along with what Trump wants here?
So right now it seems to me that Matt Gaetz is the one at most danger of not being confirmed. We don't need to go through the whole annals of accusations here right now, but it's basically sexually inappropriate behavior and some other allegations, all of which Gaetz denies. There are now lawyers coming forward saying that their clients offered up pretty damning testimony about him. I do think that on top of that, he is a very divisive figure on Capitol Hill. I don't think Republican senators are all that eager about rushing to his aid. So that's part of it. The broader part of your question is Republican senators obviously will feel pressure to be loyal to President-elect Trump, to do his bidding. And so it's the clash of those currents that's very interesting.
And you have MAGA figures like Elon Musk promising primary challenges and really kind of turning the screws on these Senate Republicans on social media. I just wonder how much that affects them, because there's also this inclination, I think, among senators to protect what's theirs, and this confirmation process is part of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, senators of either party tend to be very protective of the powers of the legislative branch. They don't want to give up their power in general terms to a president. Now, I do think that President-elect Trump is a bit of an exception to this because he has been so willing to go after people of his own party who break with him or who he considers to have shown him disloyalty. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the people who gave Republicans this majority are Trump supporters rather than institutional supporters of the Republican Party necessarily. That strengthens Trump's hand further.
I want to talk about foreign policy a little bit. In Ukraine, the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv has been closed after there were these intelligence reports of looming airstrikes. This comes after Biden approved the use of U.S.-made long-range missiles and also landmines. Is this an effort by the Biden administration in Ukraine to improve its position before Trump takes power and tries to force Ukraine to make concessions to Russia in exchange for peace?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think what we're seeing is the Biden administration trying to shore up the Ukrainian position in the belief that US aid will slow, if not be entirely cut off, to Ukraine once President-elect Trump takes power. The other element of all of this, I think, is the widespread assumption that Ukraine will be pushed to make a settlement. And to my mind, the Biden administration wants Kyiv to be in the strongest possible position there, to have basically the strongest negotiating hand if peace talks are arrived at.
Running out of time here, but I want to ask about the Middle East quickly. The U.S. has vetoed a UN Security Council resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza because it did not contain any link to the release of hostages. This is, again, the U.S. kind of going out on a limb here to defend Israel when the rest of the international community, especially at the Security Council, is trying to impose this demand for a ceasefire. What do you make of this in the last days of the Biden administration?
Briefly, I think that the U.S. has been out of step with international opinion, whether you agree with the Biden administration's position or not. It has been very separate from the international consensus, the consensus having been much more sympathetic to the Palestinians. The Biden administration is not stepping away from that even in its final weeks.
Probably would continue, one would think, under the Trump administration along those lines as well. Niall, Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Thanks so much. President-elect Trump's hush money trial is back in the news this week after court filings from District Attorney Alvin Bragg suggested freezing the case while Trump is president. For now, the president-elect's sentencing is on hold. Trump's attorneys are fighting to dismiss his criminal conviction altogether, asking the judge today for 1 month to mount a formal effort. So where does this leave the case? Will Trump start his presidency as the first felon to enter the White House? Joining me to discuss is the Hill's courts and legal reporter Zach Schonfeld. Zach, right now the ball is in the court of the judge Juan Mershon. What are his options on what he could do here?
Well, his first order of business needs to be figuring out what he's going to do with the sentencing that is scheduled for next Tuesday. Pretty much everyone I talk to expects that this sentencing is going to be delayed. So at this point, we're just waiting for an order to him to effectively make that official, because both sides now, both Bragg's office as well as Trump's own lawyers, have said they are fine with the delay of the sentencing as the judge continues to sort out what to do with this case in the future now that Trump has won the election.
Now, we've all heard of this precedent that says a sitting president can't be prosecuted, but can one be sentenced? What are the legal arguments at play here? And surely the judge isn't going to throw Trump in jail right before he takes office, right? Or while he's in office.
There seems to be pretty wide agreement that while Trump is in the White House, no criminal proceedings can move forward, whether we're talking about this sentencing, motions, anything of the like. But the question is now that we're in this time frame between November and January 20th, where he's not actually in the White House yet, he's just president-elect. So Trump's lawyers have argued that all the protections that would apply to a sitting president should still apply to him as president-elect. They say otherwise it would be interfering with his transition, saying that making him show up to a court in New York for sentencing would interfere with his daily meetings, trying to figure out who's going to fill his cabinet and the like. So it seems to be that things are going on hold, but the real question at this point seems to now be, will it just be delayed while he's in office, or will this case be dismissed in its entirety?
Yeah, the Manhattan prosecutors want to delay it while he's president and then bring it back, I assume, once he gets out of office. How would that work? Are there any statute of limitation problems there, or are you impeding on his right to a speedy trial?
Yeah, just delaying things in theory could still open the door for this case to revive in 2029 at the end of Trump's term. So it would be a ways down the road. There's going to be a lot that happens between now and then. Not only Trump's presidency, should also note that Alvin Bragg has to stand re-election next year. In fact, if we get all the way to 2029, he'd actually be having at that point to run for another term on top of the one he has to run for an election next year. So obviously a lot can change between now and then. So in theory, they could, go to sentencing after his White House